At first glance, Hook Court in Dorset just looks like a charming old school. But right there, hidden in plain sight, just beneath the kids' playing field, there's a clue to a much, much grander and way more violent past. So, what secrets is this schoolyard holding? Let's find out. Okay, so the entire site, it's sitting inside this huge medieval moat. And that right there, that immediately raises a massive question for any archaeologist, right? What on earth was here that was so important it needed a defensive feature this big? Exactly. A moat like that, it screams, something big was here. So the team arriving on site was pretty convinced a major medieval complex was buried just under that grass. The catch? They only had 3 days to find it. So before they could even think about digging into the ground, the very first step was to really understand the one building that was still standing. By looking closely at its architecture, they could start to peel back the layers of history. It's kind of like watching time go backwards. And this is how they did it, peeling back the centuries. First, you get rid of the Victorian additions. That's the porch and an extension. Gone. Then you take off the upper story, which was probably added in the 17th century, likely after the Civil War. Next, you strip away the 16th century Tudor bits. And when all that's gone, what you're left with is the original heart of the building. So here's the really crucial part. This building was never meant to be a standalone house. The analysis, especially of those small windows, showed it was actually a block of high-status guest rooms or private chambers, smart lodgings, from way back in the 1400s. It was just one tiny piece of a much, much larger, and now totally missing, manor. Okay, so now they know what the surviving building is. The hunt was on for the rest of the manor. And the most logical place to look? Well, inside the moat, of course, right under the school's lawn. And this is where a bit of modern tech gave the team their first huge break. Geophysics surveys sent back this incredible ghost map of everything buried just centimeters beneath the turf. It's amazing, and it just brilliantly reveals the sheer scale of what was lost. I mean, you can clearly see the outlines of multiple buildings, including one that is just massive. We're talking maybe 15 or 16 meters wide. That had to be a prime candidate for the manor's Great Hall. But then historical records started to complicate things. See, old photos showed a north wing that was knocked down in the 20th century. Some people thought that was the Great Hall, but then this amazing piece of evidence pops up. A hand-drawn floor plan from the 1940s, sketched from memory by the son of the manor's butler. And it clearly marked the location of medieval toilets or garderobes, which told the experts, nope, this building was also for lodgings, not a big public hall. So the mystery just got deeper. So, the big question is, why did this grand manor just disappear? All the evidence pointed to a single catastrophic event in the nation's history, the English Civil War, and the pretty brutal impact it had on Hook Court. Right, so back in the 1640s, the manor's owner was a guy named John Paulet, a really high-ranking royalist. And because he was on the king's side, parliamentarian forces came in and seized his property. Now, sometime during all that conflict, an absolutely devastating fire ripped through the entire complex. We know from historical accounts that afterwards, the site was so wrecked that a mason was actually hired to come in and salvage any valuable materials he could find in the rubble. And check this out. Here's a detail that really drives home the sheer scale of that destruction. Records state the mason was paid to retrieve 1,500 weight of lead. I mean, that's almost certainly from the windows and the roofing. It's just a colossal amount, and it points to the complete and utter obliteration of a very large, very high-status set of buildings. So the Civil War explained why it was all destroyed, but it didn't solve the central puzzle. Where was the Great Hall? The heart of any medieval manor. And this question, well, it created a really fascinating division among the experts on the dig. Okay, so on one side you had the geophysics expert, John. His data was pointing emphatically to one specific area of the lawn with these really strong signals. But then, on the other side, you had the archaeologists digging the trenches, led by Bridget, and they were finding actual physical evidence, walls, artifacts, that suggested the hall was in a totally different spot and oriented at a 90-degree angle to what the geophysics was saying. A real head-scratcher. And then the plot really thickened. The team digging the trenches unearthed this, a beautiful, high-status medieval floor tile. Now, this was not something you'd find in a barn or a simple kitchen. This came from the floor of a very important room. In fact, the discovery was so significant that one of the archaeologists basically said he'd eat his colleague's hat if it didn't come from a great hall or a chapel. That's how sure he was. So now the team is totally divided, right? It's a standoff. Do you trust the technology, the geophysics, that's showing a massive building in one spot? Or do you trust the actual, physical, high-status artifacts that are turning up somewhere else? The evidence was completely contradictory. And with time running out, the pressure was seriously on to figure out the layout of this lost manor. Then, in the final hours of the dig, the team finally managed to connect all the dots. They resolved the Great Hall debate, and, in the process, they uncovered a history that went far deeper than any of them could have possibly imagined. And the final verdict? It was actually a brilliant synthesis of all the evidence. It turns out Hook Court didn't have your typical barn-like Great Hall on the ground floor. Instead, it had something much rarer, a first-floor hall. This was a two-story building with the main hall on the upper level, which perfectly explained why the building was narrower, why they were finding those high-status artifacts, and it still fit the location that the trenches were pointing to. It all clicked. And with the medieval mystery solved, the historical records push the story back even further, like way further. The 15th century manor, we know that was built by Sir Humphrey Stafford, but before that, in 1344, an owner got a royal license to crenellate. That's basically permission to fortify the site. And then you go back even further. The Domesday Book of 1086 records the manor belonging to a man named Alfric, a king's thane from the Saxon era. We're talking before the Norman conquest here. So what's a thane's residence? Well, you can think of it as the Anglo-Saxon equivalent of a lord's castle. It was a fortified stronghold for a warrior who served the king directly. And these sites were often so strategically important that when the Normans came along, they just built their own castles and manors right on top of them. And this brings us full circle, right back to that giant moat. The final, absolutely stunning realization was that the medieval moat, it wasn't dug from scratch. Nope. It was almost certainly an expansion of a much, much older defensive ditch from that original Anglo-Saxon stronghold. So the moat wasn't just medieval. Its origins were 1,000 years old. So this whole journey at Hook Court revealed a timeline stretching all the way from a Saxon warrior's fort to a grand royalist manor house and finally to a Civil War ruin. It is just an incredible reminder of how much history is still hidden, often just inches below the surface of our everyday lives. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What secrets might be waiting to be found right under your own feet?